But with respect to the students, one thing that I just personally benefited from and try to continue to do is just helping them imagine their possible selves, whether it's a pre-K student or a fourth grade student, what is your possible self? Where do you see yourself? What do you, not only what you dream of doing, what can you do? And sort of how do all of your histories become part of the success that you can have? There's such power, and we call it dreaming, and people roll their eyes. Dreams are just dreams, but no, dreams are the foundation for creating actual pathways. And so these exercises where we're journaling or we're creating art projects or we're making a cookbook, right? Those are our possible selves emerging. And that would be, I think, where we start with helping students see themselves as college students, and more, beyond that.
I think we should probably get started with the elephant in the room. A lot of the questions that came in when people registered had to do with what the future is holding, especially in the current political situation. So Adam, I was wondering, as Misha mentioned before, the US has always had this, when we look historically, the xenophobia and welcoming of immigrants combined together, going from one pendulum to the other. It seems these days that we may be swinging more towards the xenophobic side, and teachers are understandably worried about what they can do to support their students. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts about what they should be thinking about, what you're thinking about.
Oh, just a small question. Thanks, Ariana. First of all, I know that Misha, Jess, and Graciela all have thoughts here too, but so let me share what's top of mind for me. One is I think that as we listen, at least what I'm hearing from educators is there's two things going on here at the same time, and there's probably many more. But in the immediate moment, there is the xenophobic bullying that is reaching epidemic levels from what I can tell, right? It's the stories that we're hearing are horrifying. I mean, just horrifying. The one that got me there is a friend of mine who runs a wonderful organization. Her daughter was surrounded the day after the election by a group of kids twice, actually, in the same day. And they told her to pack up, time to go home. This is a girl born in the States, daughter of a refugee. And so thinking about those kind of actions, and then there's this imagination, which is frightening because the rhetoric is frightening, right? Some of it sounds like it's a policy, right? That it's hard to know exactly what will happen. We hear about deportations, right? We hear about closing work permits. We hear about the TPS program, the temporary protected status, but it's just there in the back of people's heads. And it's not the same as the bullying, but Misha showed a statistic that 85% of kids in 2016 that was getting in the way of them doing their academic work. So I think we have to be really careful in breaking down what we know is happening right now and thinking also about what that future is like. But we also have to be careful not to exacerbate fear. What policies are right now are clear. Right now, at this date, the immigration enforcement, right? ICE is not supposed to be doing immigration enforcement at school, right? So to think that may change, but that's policy right now. And so I think we need to be clear. If I were an educator, where I would be prioritizing my energy right now is building really, really good relationships with immigrants and their students and their families. I would be looking at building really strong relationships with community organizations and using the role of the school. Misha's really good at reminding me about the power of the school as a convener to bring in people. So bring in folks who can offer legal services, who can offer other kinds of services. Make sure that that support is offered without any stigma, right? So everybody can come in and doesn't feel labeled. And I would also be reaching out to, actually, I would be reaching out to law enforcement and trying to understand what is law enforcement thinking in your community. I know that there's been a number of school districts I've talked to have actually been want to get a sense, right? Will law enforcement comply? What, with with whatever federal dictates, or is that they recognize that that's a federal responsibility, not a local responsibility, which is the way that the U.S. law is written right now. How will things happen? Because I think you need to get a sense of scenarios and help plan for them. But I also don't think you want to exacerbate any fear. I don't know if that was useful, but I just wanted to try to make some distinctions.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate the how you're thinking about all this. Misha, Jessica, Graziella, do any of you have anything you'd like to jump in and share? Or else we can move on. I'm sure we'll get back to this because it's just interwoven into everything right now.
Ariana, let me throw
Yeah.
one other element of this which I failed on, which is as important it is to get law enforcement in the conversation. We also make sure that our staff understands our roles, right? Sometimes I think that the staff needs to be on the same page, right? So, for example, again, I nod to Misha on this. We got to make sure that counselors understand their role in reporting, right? Schools are not supposed to be collecting data about folks' migration status. So when kids want to report a bullying incident, what happens if the counselor doesn't understand their role in the reporting laws? Jess and I were on a call last week where it turned out that many school systems are using a platform for school registration that's asking about documentation status. That's against the law. That's against the law. I do not believe that every teacher in the country understands that, and every teacher in the country has to understand the law. So the staff needs to be on the same place too.
Yeah, and to that, oh, go ahead, Misha.
I was gonna say, I think I'm following up with that too, and thinking about like who holds what data, and also offering support without stigma. And I think especially as we go into the new year, really thinking about what resources are currently available for students, and perhaps like what information is asked or expected to be divulged in terms of accessing those resources, and really thinking about what that experience is potentially going to be like for individuals. We have rules in place. We know that they could change. And so really being in touch with, again, I think your school staff, your community members, like the people who are in this work with you in terms of supporting our immigrant origin individuals is like, what information are we asking? Are we holding? What does that look like? And again, making sure that we're still able to get resources out to people, perhaps like without some of the same red tape signing up. And so really thinking about those systems comprehensively and making sure that no one falls through the process because perhaps they're now scared to sign up for the information and give an address, and just really thinking about the ways in which these things could play out.
Yeah, absolutely. And to that, I would add, we just last month had Amanda McAdam, who's a school nurse, talking in one of our webinars about the important role that school nurses play. She was talking about mental health and well-being with immigrant students as far as directing people and supporting content area teachers to help their students get the best possible resources. For my next question, I wanted to shift over to you, Graziella, and go back to the little mini scenario we had about immigrant origin students and leadership roles. I know that with your research, you've done quite a bit about leadership identity, also student activism. So I'm hoping you could tell us a little bit more about your research and also how it relates to immigrant students.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm reflecting on Misha's earlier slide about the ecology of identity, and I really think that's sort of the heartbeat of what we're talking about with respect to leadership development. It's this understanding that immigrant origin student in front of us is not just that, right? We're not just looking at the monolithic understanding of what immigrant origin means, and not just what they are, in their visible identities, but there's intersectionality happening here too, right? So are they an immigrant origin student of color? Are we thinking about their family's financial situation? Are we thinking about, sort of where they are in terms of their documentation status, right? And so when we think leadership, part of the piece here is also understanding, given their identities, how students think about leadership. What is it? Who does it? Right? We understand there's classist and sort of colonialist ways of thinking about leadership. Can they even see themselves in those roles? But it's it's pivotal and so critical that we help them kind of come to that place of value and belonging, I'll say, even in this sort of sitting in this space of having leadership capacity, because they do, right? I'm speaking from my own experience as a first-gen student of immigrant origin. At 6 or 7 or 8, I'm filling out paperwork for mom and dad because I, as a broker in sort of the language, and that's leadership, right? So it's sort of helping situate students in their own power, given the many identities that they hold. And sort of, that leading to a sense of self-efficacy, and self-efficacy is tied to success, and success is tied to potential college enrollment and then attainment, and sort of thinking about the pathways that start with just recognizing the intersections at which these students, that they inhabit. So that's sort of how I come to the work that we do. I don't know if that answered the question, but that's sort of what I was thinking.
Yes, thank you. And thank you also for bringing up that idea of intersectionality and identity, right? Because we bring so many different parts of ourselves and our communities to school and to our everyday lives. I'd like also to dive in a little bit more to talk about bullying. I listened to just a fantastic webinar that Adam and Misha did last week, where they really went in depth about discrimination and bullying, things that we can do. I encourage everyone to sign up for their mailing list so that you can hear about these different programs that they're doing. But Adam and Misha, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about what you went into in that webinar, about things that, given just the state of things these days and how much bullying there is and that teachers are seeing, what are some other suggestions that you have for teachers? I guess sort of jumping off of this question in the mini scenario of, if you were a teacher and you saw this happening, what would you do? What would be the first things you would think of?
Misha, you want me to take it, or would you like to? It's up to you.
You can go first, and then I'll build off of you.
Excellent. Excellent. I mean, first of all, I think it's worth recognizing. Misha said something that's really important, right? Misha pointed out that non-immigrant students report that they're less likely to intervene when immigrant students respond. So that says to me that there's some norm setting that needs to be done. The norm setting is that this matters as much as any other form of bullying, right? And so that means our responses matter the most right now. And so I think Amisha said it clearly. I think we got to make sure that we are responding, and we're responding to the victim, and making sure that the victim is feeling safe and doing whatever we can. But we also need to be making sure that we're sending a message to the larger school community that this is not okay. Misha said this, but I want to underscore it and maybe make it very explicit. I would directly review your school's bullying policy and make sure it explicitly states that anti-immigrant bullying is unacceptable. I have not talked to a school district this year that actually that had a policy that said that. And I've talked to some wonderful school leaders, wonderful people. And they're like, huh? Wait a minute. Why doesn't our policy say that? So I think people may mean well, but they don't even know. So that's a piece too. I think how you then try to do some conflict resolution, I think depends upon the practices at the school. There's a lot of talk about restorative justice practice. I think it's really, really important. But I also want to make sure that you're not putting people in an uncomfortable situation. I'm talking about the folks who've been targeted, right? And so want to make sure that we're doing this instead of saying, okay, we're going to just have a conversation here. Good restorative justice practice, make sure that you're honoring the folks who have been targeted. So, again, I would think a lot about what's going on in the school culture that's sending a message that this is a place where this stuff is acceptable or not, right? And then I would just say, this is my cheating. We've written, I think, a pretty good guide called Fostering Belonging, a guide to addressing anti-immigrant bullying. And it goes into this, talks about how do we think about activating bystanders? How do we activate our peers? How do we activate the school community? So I would suggest looking at a lot of that. But the last thing I want to say is, in this thing that Misha shared earlier about statistics around anti-immigrant bullying, there was an equal percentage of this bullying that was coming from school staff as it was coming from students. I want to think about, how do we, as school staff, I don't care your role, do something about it and check colleagues. I know I have walked away when I've heard school staff, my colleagues saying anti-Mexican stuff when I used to teach. That wasn't the right response. I needed to say something. All right. Instead, I created a safe space, but that wasn't enough. So I want to think about, how do we actually find the courage and find the support we need to say that this culture has to stop.
Yeah, I think that you kind of covered all the things that I was going to say. I think one of the things that we do have is right as a community guidelines building activity. And so really thinking from the beginning of the year, how we can have students be in collaboration with each other to build those norms of like, what is the culture you want to see, feel, what does that look like? And then building those norms with students. So when there is a breakdown in our community expectations, we can pause the moment. I know there's always the conversations around intent and impact. And sometimes, again, putting a spotlight on that student isn't the right moment. And so when you have those community guidelines to fall back on, you can pause, go into independent work, and then perhaps address it the next day, saying, okay, like there was a breakdown in terms of the norms that we have all signed up for and that we want to see in our classroom. How are we going to rectify the situation? Like, what does this look like so that we all feel safe to learn again? And again, I think that really takes that initial buy-in, and as we know, as educators, is so dependent on those relationships that we build with the students, especially in the beginning of the year, to set the expectation. But as Adam pointed out, just having one classroom as a safe space does not address a culture of school-wide bullying. And that really is where I think we need to learn on our fellow adults. And I think that that's why I like that exercise of putting yourself into the mindset of a fourth grader. Once again, this is something that we see time and time again in schools, is sometimes there is a replication of a bullying culture, or like a cliquish culture, we can even say, within schools. And so there is as we've seen in the surveys, staff that replicate hierarchies, that replicate power dynamics, and that feed into them themselves and have preferential treatment for students who was perceived as having more power within spaces, and that being something that is then replicated in terms of the world that they enter in post-graduation. And I think that is where we have that really important moment to speak with and connect with adults and really recognize where we may be playing into some of these patterns of power dynamics. And when adults are leading into or even exacerbating the bullying, which we're also seeing that in those surveys, that's really the moment where we can have those more challenging conversations with our fellow adults. And like, that's when, as we say earlier, like not spotlighting the child, but spotlighting the other adults in those spaces. And again, really thinking about what does that look like to have, or to call into conversation a colleague. And again, that is those relationships, but perhaps having a PD to address like bullying in community amongst adults. Like if you're seeing it happen amongst adults, it replicates almost immediately amongst students. And so what can we do to get out of those patterns of behavior as adults that our students are then mirroring after? And so I think that that's where we can be a little bit more hands-on versus, I think, as Adam pointed out, like we do not want to create a space in which the individual who's on the receiving end of comments is then further put in the spotlight or further made to bear the brunt of the situation. And so really thinking about how we can start with it at that adult level and mirror for our students what community building looks like, especially knowing that we're teaching our young people who are going to be the leaders of the communities that we become elders in. Like, do we want to create communities where we become elders in, where power dynamics and abuse of those who have less than us is commonplace? Like perhaps even connecting to people at a human level like that can help, especially in thinking about how we can make this a conversation that happens, once again, is not partisan. We have the mandated need to support and protect all of our students.
Yeah, Misha, thank you so much for sharing. And Adam, also these statistics that are really, I found them really eye-opening, especially thinking about what's happening on the teacher level and on the adult level. I wanted to bring us back though into the classroom. Oh, yes, please go ahead.
One quick thought, Misha, you said the word reproduction, and again, I'm at the university level, but one thing that, in terms of culture and creating climate that, is dignified and human, I've sort of stopped using ground rules. At the beginning of class, we always sit down like, all right, what are the ground rules? Because, there's sort of understanding that ground rules are actually quite silencing, right? Particularly to populations where there's power differential and power distance already. So when we're using ground words like show respect or, respect to whom, and by whom and for whom. And so even thinking about the language we use about how people can advocate for themselves based on what is required, what is appropriate. In that, no, if I'm being bullied, if I'm being made to feel less, made to feel other, then there's no room for respect. There's room for civil conversation across difference. We can disagree. There will be conflict, but being really careful about what we say and what we norm around creating a culture in our spaces, in our classrooms.
Yeah, thank you. And that's applicable for so many people and so many groups. So thank you for bringing that up. I think, I see Adam's typing an answer, but I also want to ask Jessica to make sure we get to Karen's question in Q&A. Her question is, do you have any advice for fostering belonging in communities? In communities that have small immigrant populations?
Is that for all of us, or do you want me to?
Could you get started, unless someone else has an answer that they'd like to jump in with? This is a question we get all the time about, or people are saying, this is such an important topic. However, I live in a community without many immigrant students. What can I do? Because I also want to make sure that my students are prepared to go forward and be as Misha said, become the type of adults that we want to see. What would you say to these teachers?
Yeah, I would direct them to Adam and Misha and the really fantastic resources. And I'm really not joking. And I would say this if they were not on the call as well, that there's just really phenomenal resources and just language around. And Misha and Adam have both said this on tonight's conversation of migration being a through line. I can't tell you the number of kiddos that I have taught who are of like European descent, but from many, many generations ago, who, when you ask them to examine their migration backgrounds before coming to this country, they're like, well, I don't know. I'm just American. And haven't necessarily been raised to think about their migration backgrounds. And so I think one thing that builds empathy is, as Adam and Misha do so beautifully in all of the works and the resources that they have freely available on their website, are ways in which you can center those stories of migration as a connection point, as a through line for all of us. And those stories look different. Some of our stories of migration are stories of migration by choice, and others by force, and some in between. But that there is commonality in some of those key elements of migration, of where were places where you felt welcome, where there are places where you felt unwelcome. There's a really phenomenal conversation guide that Reimagining Migration does in connection with Professor Carola Suarez-Orozco at the Harvard Immigration Project on, it's called Moving Stories, that invites young people, honestly, I do this with adults all the time, to share a story of migration. And that story of migration can be one that crosses national borders or one that crosses neighborhood borders and anything in between. And I find it so beautiful in the reflections that come out of that, of the ways in which students who are sharing stories that differ widely in the century even of when they've chosen to share about migration, still find connection points and build empathy. And so I think that's one big one, is really trying to center those stories of migration, that everyone has stories of migration, not necessarily immigration, but stories of migration. And many stories of migration likely. And so how do we make that as a place where it really shifts the conversation of us versus them, which is often used, particularly in communities where there might be less immigrant members, to this is a shared experience. It might look different, it might feel different for very important reasons, but that there is some shared commonality. I think too, for our history teachers and our social studies teachers, our English teachers in the room, and honestly, our science and math teachers can bring them in as well, is centering immigrant history into the curriculum in so many different ways. It really has been taken out of the curriculum. And when it's put in, it's a very, very modest and very specific way. So Adam, Misha, and I were at a presentation 2 weeks ago with Angel Island, and the sort of historic sort of focus in classrooms of teaching about Ellis Island, but not Angel Island in San Francisco. And if you're just teaching Ellis Island, you have a very specific, narrow story of what immigration looks like and how immigrants experience that. If you teach Angel Island alongside that, it becomes much more complex. And that's just one of many examples of teaching and centering the history of immigration. I mean, the 1924 Immigration Act, which excluded hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people for decades and totally transformed what the country looked like. I was not taught this. Why was I not taught this? It's really important. There's so many laws and cases that I can point to. Why was I not taught this? And so that's another way that communities who have fewer immigrant members and are just thinking about how do we build empathy and connection point of centering this history would be another suggestion I'd have. But look at Reimagining's resources.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I think in building off of that, there's a variety of steps that we have. I think a few things, as just pointed out, making diversity visible. So including those stories immediately already, just making a fabric of learning about different cultures and histories as just that being a first step. But then also some of the things that we have are like an alliance club. So maybe you only have a few immigrant origin students, but you can build out a broader alliance club that is then able to be joined by all students where they can brainstorm different ways to just have representative stories. Another, though, is also thinking about what does newcomer intake into your school look like in general? What kind of onboarding, what kind of social environment are they entering at? Perhaps you don't have any newcomer or immigrant origin students yet, but what does it look like for a new student to join your school in general? What systems do you have in place for building out community for them? Like all of these things will be readily available and needed if ensure you do have an immigrant origin newcomer student. And so really thinking about what does the social environment look like for your most vulnerable student? And if they have an easy entrance into community and belonging, then you've started to set the foundation. Another thing that we can also think about too, though, is the broader community. And so we have community audit tools that ask you to go around to just like look at your environment, look at the youth spaces, like where are there opportunities for young people to safely meet and gather, to develop their identity, to explore different topics of interest. So is it your local library? Do you have a teen center? Like where are there places where newcomers could safely send their children and recognize like, okay, this is a space where my child can go and make friends and that there are trusted adults who are going to make sure that they are in, a safe environment to learn and grow, but also perhaps like not always an academic one where they can actually, develop hobbies and interests. Like, what does that look like in your community? Do you have a park? Is the park accessible by public transportation? Do you have a movie theater? Is it financially accessible? Like, what are the different things that young people can do in your community to make friends and build relationships and have people to rely on one another? And it also kind of comes with an audit of like, okay, what is the school community? Like, are students reminding each other when there's an exam tomorrow? What does that look like? Like, how are students stepping in to support each other and just doing that initial audit, even if you have, I think, a small immigrant origin population, of just like doing an assessment of your community. So when you do, or perhaps have new students, you already have steps in place. And then again, with that community audit, it's like, what does that look like then also for their families? Like, what are the organizations you're in contact with? What is your relationship with museums and libraries? Like, how can we already have these things in place and really creating cohesive school systems where people of all ages are invested in their schools and kids' academics and are going to see, going to the games to cheer on the young people in their community, going to performances to support the young people, and then also vice versa. Like, how are there systems where perhaps we can value and cherish the knowledge that elders have in their community? Like, how can we have everyone invested in creating our schools as community centers and bringing in our libraries and museums and just being really in systems that we can lean on each other? And we can already start to do that work, even if we don't have newcomers in our communities yet.
Yeah, Misha, thank you so much. I know we only have 2 minutes left, so I wanted to make sure I asked Graziella this last question, since we are thinking about the future and how to prepare students for the future. And I wanted to ask you specifically about preparing students for higher education. I know this is something you've thought a lot about. Just could you give us sort of a brief overview of some things that K through 12 teachers should be thinking about for preparing their students, especially immigrant origin students?
Yeah, my mind immediately goes to less responsibility on the students, more responsibility on the systems and the structures at the higher education level that could enable success and support and belonging, and of course mattering. But with respect to the students, one thing that I just personally benefited from and try to continue to do is just helping them imagine their possible selves, whether it's a pre-K student or a fourth grade student, what is your possible self? Where do you see yourself? What do you, not only what you dream of doing, what can you do? And sort of how do all of your histories become part of the success that you can have? There's such power, and we call it dreaming, and people roll their eyes. Dreams are just dreams, but no, dreams are the foundation for creating actual pathways. And so these exercises where we're journaling or we're creating art projects or we're making a cookbook, right? Those are our possible selves emerging. And that would be, I think, where we start with helping students see themselves as college students, and more, beyond that.
Thank you so much. I love that idea of thinking about our possible selves. It's just so inspiring, something to take away. We're about out of time, but I just wanted to give an opportunity if anyone has any last thoughts that they'd like to leave our webinar participants with, call to action, piece of advice. Now's your time to share it with us.
And to say it one more time, relationships matter.
Always an asset-based perspective.
I think that there's a role for all of us to be playing in this work, and that there are not one way to be involved in this work. There are many different ways to be involved in this work.
And we wouldn't be able to do it without folks like yourselves. And like every little thing you do, one student that now feels like there is a safe space for them, like that is a world. That like every person is a world, and that we are in this world together. But like also any little relationship that you can make is, beyond profound.